Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, a regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site, we have Joel Simkins, founder and CEO of X Capital Group, Scott Sadin, co-CEO of IC360, Desiree Dickerson, co-founder and CEO of THNDR, and Carson Hubbard, founder and CEO of Rebet. We're here to discuss CFTC Event Contracts, innovation in gaming, regulatory framework, market impact, and potential future developments. Lots to unpack here. Thank you for joining us on Trade Talks. Joel, let's go around the table first. I want to set some context for the audience. Give us a brief overview of what you guys have going on at X.
Yeah, I'm the CEO and founder of X Capital Group. I launched my digital gaming investment banking boutique a year ago after a 28-year career on Wall Street working at big banks like Houlihan, Lokey, Credit Suisse, Macquarie, and a couple of other ones. We're extremely busy right now. M&A is really heating up in the space. Capital raising activity, despite the headwinds, is still quite strong, and this is a very dynamic, fast-growing industry, and there's a lot to unpack that we'll talk about this afternoon.
Yeah, there certainly is. And Scott, tell us about what's going on at IC360.
Thanks for having me, Jill. IC360 provides a variety of different compliance and regulatory technology tools and services across the sports betting, iGaming ecosystem, and so the one we're probably the most known for is our integrity monitoring and prohibited betting service, and so we basically look for anomalies and circumstances of potentially suspicious wagering, potential match fixing, game manipulation, prohibited betting circumstances, and then we provide that alerting and investigative tools to sports properties, sportsbook operators, regulatory agencies, et cetera.
All right, and tell us, Desiree, THNDR.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm CEO and co-founder of THNDR, and we build PvP skill-based games where iGaming operators can easily drag and drop our games, and we've really solved the player liquidity problem with our inter-operator matchmaking. And skill gaming is pretty new, especially to the iGaming space, and so we're starting to fill some voids where we're seeing a little bit more regulation, scrutiny come in.
Yeah, it's interesting. You kind of hear a lot of the same terms when you think about digital assets and TradFi when it comes to the infrastructure and surveillance. Carson, tell us about Rebet.
Yeah, Jill, I really appreciate you having me here today. Rebet is one of the first of its kind free-to-play social sportsbooks and casinos. And so what Rebet's all about is providing a safe, fun, engaging way for friends to connect on their favorite sports and favorite games online, while also, staying compliant with all federal and local state laws.
Yeah. So Joel, tell us about CFTC Event Contracts. What are they? How do they function?
It's been a pretty wild ride. So, one of the leaders in this space is a group called Kalshi. They've raised a bunch of capital, been around for a few years. Honestly, they're really kind of considered an afterthought. And then the 2024 election came around, and there was a huge uptick in activity. There's been some sweeping changes in the regulatory environment. They've seen a flood of activity, growth in their business, some pretty high-profile, wagering activity, or it depends on how you want to frame it, wagering or event contracts. I see it more as wagering, but it has really become, kind of one of the biggest talking points in the sector, and it's really caught the attention of the traditional sports betting companies, as well as upstarts like Carson's business, other groups in the daily fantasy sports space. So it's a hyper fast evolving product. We'll see how it shakes out in the next couple of years. It's interesting. I was at the Phillies game last night with a semi-professional sports bettor, and he was telling me how, unlike on the traditional sports books, he can get down, $50,000 wagers without really blinking an eye. If you're a serious sports bettor, that doesn't necessarily happen on DraftKings and FanDuel. Right. So it's unlocking a market that maybe didn't exist, and we'll see how it plays out again in the next couple of years.
It sounds like it's almost like leveraging what you would in the futures market in a way.
It's very similar to a traditional sort of trading environment. And so that is why I think it's caught the eye of a lot of sort of quantitatively driven individuals. From a regulatory perspective, many of the prediction market participants and event contract platforms are governed and have oversight from the CFTC, right? And traditional sportsbook platforms, traditional sports betting operators, of which sometimes they are compared to, they are governed at and oversight at the state level. That's where they're licensed. That's where there's actual regulations and oversight that they have to follow. And so that is the primary difference from an oversight in government.
Yeah. You're also seeing different products that you can wager on. It's not just sports, right? We could be talking about mainstream things in pop culture. Okay, who's going to win the Oscar or the Grammy? So you're potentially unlocking a different customer that maybe isn't a sports bettor, but wants to bet on the outcome of their favorite television show, what's going to happen at the end of the season.
And in fact,
who's going to die on the White Lotus?
In fact, at Kalshi, that was really sort of the initial approach. It wasn't sports. It was all of the other tangential types of markets that people wanted to engage in.
Yeah, it's like another form of almost social media in a way. It's a community that's coming together. So let's talk about sweepstakes betting for a moment. I'm thinking like Ed McMahon in my head, right? Clearly, it's evolved from there. So tell us more about that business.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a clear difference between the sweepstakes market and the regulated iGaming market. And one of the biggest differences is that sweepstakes is free to play. You're never going to have to go on and make a purchase in order to participate and play in our games, right? And so really at Rebet, what we're focused on is creating an environment that's safe for users to come and engage, an environment that's inclusive for anybody to come and enjoy, so long as that you meet the requirements, right? And what we're dealing with right now is just navigating these different federal and state laws, right? Because every law is going to regulate sweepstakes differently. And so right now we are offering sweepstakes in 43 out of 50 states for anyone 18 years or older. But we see the majority of our players, if not all of our players, are using these free-to-play mechanisms, whether that's the free daily dollar that you get or our 6 other alternative methods of entry that we provide for people to get access to the game.
And Desiree, that's what the challenge is. You're operating in a multi-jurisdictional environment, and there's lack of a federal framework around it.
There is some type of framework, like this 3-element test, which is prize, chance, and consideration, and that's a framework in which we're all trying to operate. Yet we find ways to operate and innovate. Yet they claim that what we're doing is not necessarily following in the framework in the way in which they want. So, with sweepstakes, we do skill gaming, so we really hit at that skill chance element of the 3-element test, where what we're doing is completely skill-based. Now, we aren't under as much like kind of regulatory scrutiny as I would say sweepstakes, but we're kind of next in line, right? So yeah, it's really, in my mind, really stifling innovation. We had mentioned like this is following very similar to what the crypto industry is seeing, where there are these frameworks, you start to innovate around them, and then regulators say, wait, this isn't exactly what we met, and so we're asking, actively, can you clarify, can you put into place more structured frameworks for which we want to comply? But that hasn't happened yet, and again, like a story as old as time, that regulation really kind of just follows innovation.
Right. Well, I mean, the challenge is too, I think there was this expectation that regulating and creating these frameworks around whether it's digital assets, emerging AI, sectors such as gaming, was going to happen right away. And it's, there's other areas of policy that you're concentrating on right now. So it's hard to make investments in areas when you don't understand the operating.
Yeah.
Particularly when the landscape is bifurcated, right? And so in a traditional sports betting operator platform, you are going state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and working with that government and usually a regulator, an oversight body. And then in the event contract space, you are working with a federal oversight body in the CFTC. And then in the sweepstakes space, I presume it's FTC, or there's another federal body in which you're working, and in some cases working on a state-by-state level. And so because of all of the layers of government and oversight that you're often having to work with, it can get complicated.
Yeah, and this is going to potentially dip into state coffers, right? Carson and his company pay a lot of sales tax. This is going to be a state versus federal conversation we're probably going to see play out in the courts the next couple of years, because if we do go into an economic downturn and states are going to be looking for revenue and ways to drive their business, but now it's being usurped by the federal government, that creates a lot of potential complexity. It has so many cascading ramifications, and ultimately that probably does spur more innovation, the expansion of iGaming, the adaptation and adoption of more digital gaming products. So it's probably long-term sector bullish, but it's going to create a lot of complexity, and I think the states are going to push back on seeing their budgets potentially impacted.
No, absolutely. And just adding on to what you said, Joel, I think a really important differentiator is that sweepstakes is offering a very different user experience than traditional iGaming companies, right? we're taking away this risk-focused narrative that is so often associated with traditional iGaming and creating an environment that is free to play so you can engage with your friends in a way that is fun and not all about the monetary gain, right? And so I'll speak for myself at Rebet. There's nothing, we are not against additional regulation. At Rebet, us being good corporate citizens, following the law, and being compliant is the most important thing. And so we work with experts at Duane Morris and KPMG to make sure that we are paying sales tax. And as Joel mentioned, we pay a lot of money in sales tax. In some states, we're paying up to 10% on every purchase. And Rebet was actually one of the first in the industry, to start charging our users sales tax on the purchase of this digital currency.
Right.
And now we've seen over 50% of the industry follow. And so by no means are we trying to skirt regulations or avoid regulatory oversight. I actually think it could be good for the industry.
I would imagine some pushback you get from the regulatory perspective is how many betting and gaming products do people need? Or are we monitoring this, not from a compliance perspective, but when you think about the ethical objections that can come up?
Yeah.
Well, from our perspective, the thing that we're always looking for is to maintain and ensure integrity in sport, right? And so if there are ways in which individuals are able to have some kind of financial gain on the outcome of a contest or an actual event or a sports market, then obviously visibility, transparency, engagement, collaboration, compliance are all really, really, really important characteristics.
Right, so you're able, from a surveillance perspective, able to see if just like a traditional brokerage account, if margin looks out of balance, or if you recognize certain patterns where this can become an issue and not necessarily an enjoyable activity, you're able to discern where that's happening?
You're always looking for correlated anomalies, right? Any kind of specific irregularity in and of itself is often not something worth or meriting investigation, but a correlated anomaly, some kind of significant line movement tied to an officiating anomaly or tied to an information release. Right. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking for.
So Desiree, back to the point I made before, we're hearing a lot of the same terminology that you from the TradFi space, from the digital asset space. In the absence of a cohesive regulatory framework, why not just operate in the environment where the states already have a regulatory regime? I realize it can be confusing because there's so many jurisdictions, but it's not as if the framework doesn't exist in some capacity.
I mean, for what we do, skilled gaming, there really is not a clear framework. It is totally unregulated. There's no real guidance whatsoever. We just try to do our best with what's been set about already that like the gambling companies operate within, and we essentially are self-regulating. Right. Like we talked before, it's very much like crypto, where we've just been, okay, we're going to do our best. We work with our law firm to get our legal opinions and only operate in states in ways in which we should operate in those states. So for instance, like certain states we can't offer card games, right, even though they are skill-based. And so, I mean, it is very, very unclear what the regulators want. Right. Whatsoever.
Well, and Jill, this is a multi-decade trend that we're going to see play out. Right? If you look at the gambling industry as a whole in the U.S., right, land-based gaming is still a massive business. But when we talk about this industry, I often bring out the internet retail analogy. The consumer doesn't want to go to Sears and Kmart anymore. They have an iPhone or an Android device in their pocket. They want convenience. They want a digital experience. And these products speak to multiple generations versus land-based legacy gaming, which, excluding Las Vegas, which is a destination, it's an aging baby boomer demographic, right? So I think it's really about what does this industry look like in terms of addressing a bigger market and giving the customer versus what they want versus maybe a tired
We spoke about that when you were on 6 months ago, appeasing to that generation that grew up on community-based platforms. And speaking of generational, I haven't heard Sears or Kmart on the show. I don't think ever, but that's a great point that you make. Let me ask you, Carson, in a different way. There are sweepstakes frameworks that are available in multiple states. You said you're 43 out of 50 states, I believe it is. So why not just continue to operate?
Yeah, so we do operate under regulatory framework. We follow the advice of our partners at Duane Morris, which, we follow a 275-page legal opinion that goes over the gambling laws state by state and why what we're offering does not constitute gambling, right? And so we follow these regulatory frameworks. I do want to push back, Jill, a little bit on one thing you said, which was that do we have concerns about giving consumers too many options, right? And I would say that's a bad way to look at things and really will stifle innovation. What we've seen in the sweepstakes space is that we're creating a new market that is actually different than what regulated iGaming sees. And this is really apparent by when VGW pulled out of Michigan. They expected when VGW, which is, as you probably know, one of the largest sweepstakes companies in the US, when they pulled out of Michigan, they expected to see iGaming revenue skyrocket because they thought VGW was taking a lot of that money. But that did not happen. And what that is really proving is that this is a different audience. Our users are different than those of the regulated iGaming space, and that's because we're offering this different experience like I touched on.
Right, and I'm glad you brought that up and did push back because, Joel, I'm hoping that the industry is advocating and addressing it the right way to the right audiences.
Yeah, I think, listen, I've been around the industry for 28 years. Nobody wants to see problem gaming issues take major precedent, right? We can look at the analogy of what happened in Europe, on Australia, where the government comes in with a very heavy hand, cracks down on marketing, other promotional activity. So I think the industry is really aware of this. We're very focused on working with companies that are in the compliance, regulatory technology space. We think that's a huge vertical. There's a number of interesting high-profile, problem gaming startups that we work with as well. And I think everybody collectively on this panel wants a responsible framework and is advocating in that direction. But you're occasionally going to have bad actors out there, and that's something that we'll have to keep an eye on.
Yeah. Well, in the last couple of minutes here, let's think about future trends and developments in regulated wagering. Where do you see this in the next 1 to 3 years?
Well, I think one of the things that's been really interesting is the type of IP or the type of actual market you can be either purchasing an event contract in or wagering on. So Joel mentioned it earlier, now you can purchase event contracts on geopolitical events, weather, a host of different things. From a traditional sports betting perspective, state to state, each jurisdiction has their own approved wagering catalog, and every single week we're seeing new types of markets being offered on those catalogs. Sports that, candidly, you probably wouldn't ordinarily think
like
of
volleyball betting or something
yeah,
like that.
or like table tennis or things of that nature. That kind of stuff is generating a lot of attention because there's appetite to engage in new forms of entertainment. And so I think that is going to be a consistent trend that we see grow year over year.
Yeah, I'm curious to see, Desiree, if one of the spaces such as AI or digital assets serves as a catalyst, and elements of that are taken into gaming.
Yeah, I mean, we do our settlement for our operator network on Bitcoin Lightning Network as a payment rails, and I think there's a lot of great user experience that can be baked into a lot of these iGaming products by using some of these other technologies in other spaces. So for us, it's crypto is a big one, and also just completely changing the way that we take payments is
because the infrastructure exists for it. Carson, do you see expanding into other areas outside of sweepstakes? Is that possible to do multiple verticals?
It's definitely something that we are talking to our attorneys about, but right now, Jill, our focus is providing the best possible user experience to our users, creating that safe, fun, engaging environment. And so right now, our concern is being compliant, following the state and local laws, while also educating people, because I think that especially the sweepstakes industry is very misunderstood and is very much often looped into the idea that this is a loophole or that it's just trying to get around state laws for traditional gambling. And that's not the case. We're offering a different experience, a gamified experience that's free to play.
Yeah, and Joel, last word here as we need to wrap up. Is there a scenario where you can have multiple types of gaming on a platform such as sweepstakes and XYZ?
I think that's a great question. I think that'll play out in the next year or two. I mean, back to this overarching discussion on the regulatory environment, right? If there's a little bit of clarity in the sweepstakes arena, there's room for additional competition in the prediction markets, you could see folks take on multiple different product types and platforms. You could see a BetMGM prediction product. You could see them enter DFS. So I think we could be having this conversation a year from now. It could be vastly different.
And I'd also add, you already are seeing this happen with Prize Picks, right? Where they have different user experiences depending on what state the user is in.
Yeah, that's a good point. Appreciate all of your insights. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.